Hey everyone, welcome back to Blockchain, Cryptocurrency, and Web3 Foundations. And this is the Blockchain Application Analysis portion of the class. So while you're reading, as per usual, go ahead and take a moment to get something and take some notes and questions that you might have for the discussions. And in particular, I'll be going through an exercise that will be part of the assignment, in fact, part of the start of your final project, your portfolio piece in this class. So do take some notes and consider what we're doing, because you're going to be doing this yourself here in no time this week. And so if you're viewing these solo, if you're not looking at this video, then I would really encourage you to take a look as you're going through this companion, and even as we are going through this video, of this World Economic Foundation's evaluation flowchart for blockchains. And so there's a PDF in the course materials, as well as I believe in this page where the module is at for this video, that you can take a peek at. And you can follow along as we're going through some of these examples. But if you're doing this independently, I encourage you, instead of marching through the slides and taking a look at least what my opinion of these particular projects are and going through this flowchart, assess this yourself and see how close you think your assessment lines up to mine. And so with that in mind, all of this that we're going to be going through is really, it's my view of how well these particular applications fit a blockchain use case. So with that, let's dive into it, right? We know that blockchain, going through the course so far, does have a lot of really interesting potential use cases, but almost assuredly, there's problems in identifying which ones are actually valuable, right? It's not really obvious what's hype and what's not. And when you get into the nitty-gritty details of how you want to implement things, then it really becomes potentially unclear about what actually is valid and a useful use case for blockchain. So one first best way to go through this that I found is using a simple flow chart. It helps really hit some of the bullet points that help you decide as an individual whether or not this use case makes sense, from a very fundamental perspective. So looking at some of the traits of what blockchains require, and then how you can apply that to this problem, if it really makes sense or not. So here, if you're having trouble reading again, there's the attached file. You can look and zoom in on this particular bit. But there are, in this case, 11 questions that we'll be going through. There also happens to be in the course materials plenty of other flowcharts that go about answering different questions and coming to different conclusions slightly. So if you find that you're not liking this one as much, go ahead and check out some of the other ones, and it might get the same effect for you. So let's do some examples together. I think the first one that we've already seen come up a few times in the course is property records management. In this case, we'll take a look at specifically Imbrex. This company is doing property records on a blockchain. So specifically, they want to look at real estate records and dealing with things like escrow on chain for real estate transactions. Right? So you can build smart contracting systems that actually incorporate cryptocurrencies. And when you're doing title management of any kind and transference, then we can have all these funds within the contract that's locked up between the parties that are selling. So in this case, our smart contract becomes the middleman in the escrow company, which is a really great way to boot out some middlemen out of this transaction, right? So that definitely seems like a convincing use case to me. Then we also are specifically trying to target regulatory compliance, because a lot of this is regulated by local laws as to what you can and cannot do in terms of property management, and integrations with things like what's the law of the zoning and things like this that are going on. So that kind of needs to be incorporated in these. This, though, means that there needs to be some kind of government oversight or potentially direct management of this system. And for real estate transactions, we do want this to be publicly auditable, meaning knowing at least who the owners are. But then there is some caveats we'll get into. Maybe we don't want to actually know all of the details, for instance, in bids for a sale, right? Some of this might want to be private information, right? But these guys have decided, specifically looking at public blockchain infrastructure is what they're going after, building on Ethereum. A smart contracting platform makes a lot of sense with their escrow. So then diving into, or I should say before we're diving into it, note that when we have a management system that needs to be in place on a public blockchain, then it may not necessarily be the best fit, right? When you have an authority that needs to be able to administrate the system, you're introducing a lot of potential problems because it's a permissionless, unadministered system that you're trying to plug into. So there's caveats. You can make it work, but something to consider as we're moving forward. So now let's dive into this flow chart. So thinking specifically about real estate management, right? Real estate transactions and property title management, right? Are you trying to remove intermediaries and brokers? Absolutely. So we're talking, there's plenty of intermediaries that we're getting rid of the system, potentially, right? Are you working with digital assets? And in this case, I would argue yes, in the sense that we're not arguing about the actual physical plot of land. It's just who's on the title. Right. So it does definitely get tricky. If we get more into the nuance of this, is how are we interacting with, again, those governing bodies that enforce property rights? Because without their enforcement, property rights really are just, again, a ledger information. And if no one enforces it, that is effectively meaningless. So something to consider here. Right. Can you create permanent authoritative record? That's what blockchains are good at in this case. Absolutely. And do we require high performance? And depending on the scale, I would argue that for the most part, though, these transactions are going to be designed in such a way that if we're just transferring titles of large real estate properties, we probably don't need millisecond ready transactions. But high performance might be an issue if this becomes an international platform. So something to consider. Do we intend to store large amounts of non-transactional data as part of your solution? And I think that Imbrex in particular is not proposing to do this. But again, as we're diving deeper, it depends on how much of this non-transactional data they'd like to store there. So if you wanted to have, for instance, bids for this particular property in an auction type mechanism that might have plenty of interactions that are happening for one transaction to settle, there might be large amounts of data that go there, as well as potentially things like blueprints and stuff. If you want to actually store this in an authoritative manner on a blockchain, that's probably not the right way to go. Interacting with the system, though, you might be able to make this work, right? Or I'd say interacting with a separate storage system that is linked to this blockchain system might work. So then, do we need or want to rely on a trusted third party for compliance? And I'd say that this is a little bit of a question mark in my mind. It's not 100% certain, but doing your due diligence, digging deeper, understanding especially that interaction with the local government and the enforcement of property rights, you really do need to have them as a trusted party to make sure that the system is working within the accordance of the law and is future-proof effectively, right? If the laws of the land change, can the system change? And that we're not entirely sure, right? So something to consider. And so here, are we managing contractual relationships and value exchange? Obviously, yes, right? Do we require shared right access? And in this case, I would say almost assuredly that we want to have the ability to transact between multiple different parties and not a specific authority that administrates any of the system. So it can run on itself. Buyers and sellers direct peer-to-peer. And so do contributors know and trust each other? I'd say absolutely not, right? If I could just go ahead and put my name on your title for your house, why shouldn't I? Right. So the system, you absolutely do not trust that it's running without validity checks and ownership checks that are in the works. I mean, we can trust. So do you need to be able to control functionality? As in, do you need to be able to administratively, top down, be able to change things or potentially retroactively change things? And this is another question mark, especially when we're talking about the laws of the land. We might need to be able to control this functionality and do some of the stuff that would break immutability guarantees and change some of the contracts that you're in. So this, not 100% sure on. Again, it would more due diligence would be needed here in this case. Right. And should transactions be public? And in this case, it's a little bit murky, but for the most part, what Imbrex is after, just the management of the title, yes, it should be. This is sort of a manner of public record, who owns what property in the world. But if we're integrating more systems around this escrow and potentially auctions and whatnot, some of these transactions you might not actually want to be public, right? Then all that said, I think that really, this is potentially a strong case for what they're going after, a public blockchain, like they're based on Ethereum. But there's definitely enough question marks that it really does justify more investigation around maybe blockchain isn't the right thing to use, or you might need to use a private or permissioned blockchain or a consortium blockchain, as we've seen in some of the readings. So that overall, I think this is a strong indicator. This is good to look at. I don't think they're after the wrong thing. So real estate on chain sounds like it's pretty feasible. We could do it. Right? Now let's look at another. So food tracking, right? Now, in particular, looking at IBM blockchain solution, the Food Trust is what they've put together, the IBM Food Trust. Most notably, and I believe it's linked in the modules reading this week, you'll look at the Walmart's integrations with IBM's Food Trust. And what they've done is in-house gone from farm to table, tracking all of the food that goes through Walmart systems. And this is actively being worked on at this point and trying to be rolled out. There's some caveats to, though, this, as we're learning more recently than when this particular slide was put together, this might be not working as well as they thought. So something to keep in mind as we're moving through this, that there's caveats. It's much harder to roll out than I thought it would be. The idea here is supply chain of your food is what we'd like to track. And we'd also like to be able to audit this, right? As a consumer, I'd like to know that the farmer themselves who pulled this out of the ground for me and certified that it was organic themselves, I'd like to be able to audit that along the way, as well as any of the processes that me as a consumer, again, that may be organic verification, I would like to know. And regulatory compliance is important here in the sense that there are, especially around food, a lot of controls and things that need to be done that can all be put on this blockchain record. Right? Here, though, it needs to be administered and managed by the company. So the Walmart in particular, in this use case, wants to be able to retroactively change things if they need to. Would there be a record of this change? Potentially, yes. But here they need to express oversight and control. So a private and permission blockchain is what they're really seeking. So they have this authority and ability to use it as they see fit. And it's built on Hyperledger is what they're after. And that's IBM's primary blockchain solution. Specifically, Hyperledger Fabric is the integration that they're going after. And I have a couple of caveats on these because they need to have explicit control of the regulatory compliance that's going on and are the effective overseer and oracle providing all of the data that's going into this system from the outside world and doing all these checks. It may not necessarily be a great fit for blockchain. But with that in mind, let's dive into this flowchart. Right. So are we trying to remove intermediaries or brokers? And in this case, yes, right. Auditing services in companies that are disjointed across the supply lines in all these different industries, or even in-house in your own very large, sophisticated food chain, like food supply chain, like in Walmart, then we are trying to bring down the overhead of needing all of these brokers. Right. Are you working with digital versus physical assets? And in this case, sort of, right? If your food obviously is a real world item, but all of the attestations as to what it might be, certified from a particular place and the particular tests that were done on your food or particular processes that were applied to your food, things that you'd like to know, those are all digital, right? And we can have all of the systems put this record into place. But one large caveat with any of the supply chains tracking of physical items in the world, that data has to come from somewhere, right? And specifically, we are trusting each one of those data inputs in some way implicitly that it hasn't been corrupted. So these physical versus real world and the attestation that a physical thing was recorded correctly digitally, it can get a little bit murky. So big caveat there, right? Can create a permanent authoritative record. And in this case, yes, especially if we're doing this on a private and permission network, because we are the authority that's able to attest to everything is working correctly, hopefully, right? High performance, this is a bit of a question mark, right? If we're talking about large scale food systems that everyone would use the same blockchain, this doesn't seem to fit. Right, that be far too much performance demand in terms of the transactions per second here. But if we're talking about individual blockchains for potentially small supply chains from farm to table, for instance, Walmart is very large, but if you apply the same system to a local farm or and potentially a local market, right? This seems like it could be a reasonable way to go about doing this. So there's caveats, depends on the scope of the planned project. Do you intend to store large amounts of non-transactional data as part of this? And it really depends. And again, this is a bit of a scaling problem, but how much information and how detailed does it need to live on chain for you to be able to trust this? So hybrid chain, on-chain system and off-chain storage systems can be put in place, but the nuance here is not entirely obvious. So further investigation would definitely be needed. Do we need or want to rely on a trusted third party? And I would say that explicitly, yes, in some cases here. Again, we need compliance and regulatory bodies who can certify things to come in and actually administrate some of these checks. So we do need to trust them and know that they're doing their job right in some way. And it definitely goes out of scope of this particular system, how that gets done. So unless there's standards that can be integrated into this blockchain system about how we can remove trust from those auditing and certification bodies, then it is unclear, right? So with that in mind, though, like, are we trying to manage contractual relationships and value exchange? Yes, and I'd say especially when we're considering the inputs and outputs of this supply chain, the farm to table, or quite literally those inputs and outputs, those contractual relationships we want to honor. And do we require shared write access? Yes, and those inputs and outputs along with the whole supply chain in between and everyone who needs to touch this, there's a lot of shared access. Okay. Do contributors know and trust each other? And in this case, I'd say no. There's a lot of reasons, right, where you might want to lie about a particular test going true or false, or a particular date that things arrived or were processed at a particular place. So yes. Now, do you need to be able to control functionality? Absolutely. In this case, specifically for the food trust system, having these authorities to be able to potentially retroactively change things may be a record of this, but putting your system in the control of an administrative body is what they're very much interested in at the moment. So with all that, there's a lot of question in my mind if this is the right way to go. And specifically, as we mentioned, the things about these oracles for these certification bodies and regulatory compliance that needs to go on is probably the biggest thing that I'd be worried about, as well as with almost all of these supply chains, being able to integrate that real world interaction and data, certifying that in any way into a digital ledger. You have to trust there that could potentially break the blockchain use case overall. So it's not specific to this IBM's food trust necessarily. I'd say it's systemic to this particular use case. So it's questionable. Now, they're definitely going for a private and permissioned chain. And as you'll see in the readings, this might not work for some of the reasons we're talking about. All right, and then there's one more use case that I want to go through with you. This is a customer loyalty token, and this site might still be up, loyaltytoken.org, but the general idea of this customer loyalty token is much like you might see at King Soopers or international, or I should say nationally, Kroger, right? Having reward points for shopping at a particular place, or a credit card, for instance, you might get reward points or airline miles for using it. So that's what they're after, is a tokenized cryptocurrency for this. So the key value proposition here for them is that it's decentralized, as they talk about in their marketing material. And because of this, they're raising a crowd sale, so taking a lot of funds to build out the system for people to use. Right? It's open source, so you can view their code. And this, though, as you dive in a little bit into what they're doing, is very shallow. They don't really have a lot of code. In fact, it's just a token that they're selling here, right? So token holders here can convert these loyalty tokens to cash in exchanges. So it's another one of the key value propositions, meaning that they've raised a bunch of funds, and now the token is out there in the wild. They're also seeding exchanges so that you can exchange these tokens now for whatever kind of other token you'd like. And really, this is supposed to achieve customer loyalty and giving them options to be able to potentially unlock some of the value that otherwise would be inaccessible to them. For instance, I can't sell in an open market my Kroger points, right? So this could potentially solve that issue. But as you can see, I'm very skeptical about this particular use case. This falls into the category of an ICO, initial coin offering, that you saw a lot in 2017. And specifically here, I think that, as we'll go in the flowchart, this is not a very convincing use case for blockchain in general, and potentially is on the borderline scam in terms of they don't really have a very good value proposition and already raised plenty of money to support their project. So definitely use caution here. If anybody is selling something to you for an unfinished product, it's a big red flag. Not necessarily that it's bad, right? But you should put your thinking cap on and dive a little bit deeper to see if it really is just a scam. So are we trying to remove intermediaries or brokers? It's not entirely clear, especially if you're trying to do loyalty for a specific entity, as opposed to largely, for instance, a token that associates the interaction with a particular industry, like video watching or something like this. It seems like it's much more targeted. So almost assuredly, you're not trying to remove any intermediaries or brokers. You're just trying to change the system in which they operate in. Right? Are you working with digital assets? Well, yes. These are all just effectively ledgers somewhere right now of customer loyalty points, and this puts it on a decentralized ledger. Right? Can you create a permanent authoritative record? And in this case, yes. Right? All of these transactions can be recorded by someone and reported in the form of a token somewhere. High performance, that's definitely depending on the scale, right? If this really did take off and was used widely, then we might need very, very high transaction performance here. So it really depends. Do we intend to store large amounts of non-transactional data? It seems as though no, but depending on how this ended up being used, one of the largest things for customer reward programs is not the actual input and output that this program provides, but the data that it provides about the customers. And my guess is that many institutions would be after that metadata about how their customers are using things. And a free market for tokens to be exchanged for customer loyalty doesn't give them any of this information. So they might want to bake that in, or it might be a reason to not use this kind of system at all. Do we need to rely on a trusted third party for compliance reasons? And in this case, yes, you definitely do. The customer loyalty points should be associated with whatever business is going to be able to redeem these. So they need to be the ones that you're trusting to administrate this as well. All right, managing contractual relationships, yes. And how do you require shared right access? That's really kind of unclear. The value proposition does go on to say that it's effectively a free market once these customer loyalty tokens are minted, that you can sell them and trade them and do whatever you'd like. But in traditional systems that use customer loyalty points, the real authority here is the business that gets to decide whether or not to give these any kind of value, really, in their store or not. So if that's something that the company desires, this is probably not the kind of system they'd like, right? They'd like to have single right access. They're the ones in complete control. Do contributors know and trust each other? No, in this case, I definitely wouldn't trust customers at my shop to not produce these out of thin air. So it makes sense why you might want to use a blockchain for this, right? Do you need to be able to control functionality? And in this case, I again, if I was using this in my business, would want to be able to control this. And should transactions be public? And as I was alluding to earlier about the metadata around what customers are doing and buying, then maybe some of that shouldn't be public, or at least the customer, me as a customer using this system, I wouldn't necessarily want this all to be public or even known by the company potentially, but the company probably would. So it really is a big question mark in my mind. So I'm highly skeptical of this as a general use case. In particular, this specific offering doesn't sound like a very good one in my mind. There's too many holes and caveats as to how it would be implemented in the real world and used by actual businesses and customers here. So I'd say probably not. But if it really wanted to dive into deeper, this as a class might have some promise, but I'd say that there's still too many questions to be answered. So with that, I want to leave you guys with this industry snapshot of now that's a little bit older, taken, I believe this is a Stanford study in 2019, is what people are using blockchains for outside of specifically the cryptocurrency use case, so for just transacting, right? And it turns out that Ethereum is definitely the largest player in the ecosystem here, and I think that notionally I've seen this march up as well. Ethereum is definitely taking over the market in a lot of places. But definitely high up there, we see Hyperledger being used, Hyperledger Fabric in particular, as a private and permissioned chain. And other people are working on plenty of other different projects. And now in 2021, this has definitely a few other larger players, but again, by and large, Ethereum is winning. And so primary use cases for blockchain that were reported in this case study are around records and verification. So supply chains and also records management and verifiable credentials and identity stuff, you'll see all over the place. And that's definitely all kind of wrapped into this bubble. Now, payments and money transfers, I think, is underrepresented here in the sense that we're talking about cryptocurrency specifically in and of itself. That's still really one of the largest use cases for actually transacting. But quite a lot of this ends up happening off-chain on exchanges, and then is finally settled out and mostly stagnant when people pull this into their own wallets, and then it mostly is just held there in those wallets. But again, as we're moving into 2021 and beyond, there's plenty more applications, especially in the Ethereum space, in that dApp land, as we've talked about in the last modules, that are coming online that are changing this quite substantially. So a little bit out of date, but it gives you a sense of kind of what people are thinking about and sort of the trends in the industry. So with that, I hope that you find this examples that I've given around this flow chart, this relatively simple tool that can help you quickly identify if this is a go or no go, and key you in on some of the things that you should be thinking about when you're looking into a blockchain solution. And you'll be going further into this in the assignment this week, specifically diving into exploring what use case you'd like to have as a case study later on in the end of the semester here. And this will be the entry point to decide on if this is a viable blockchain solution to do a case study around. And so next module, we'll go ahead and identify some of the resources that you can use once you've decided on a good or bad use case to help really refine and answer some of those more detailed questions that'll help you make that case study great. So with that, thank you all. See you later.